Hello to another episode of this Flutter tutorial. Today I want to discuss with you some typical problems of mobile development or development for different devices and how Flutter addresses them. So let's start with libraries. If you open up pub/dev, you'll already get a list of most popular packages, and that's a good starting point. And whenever you feel to develop something more complicated or something which might be usable for other applications, have a look first at pub/dev. If you develop by yourself, it's always a good idea to pick one of the libraries available already to speed up your development. If you work in a team, however, and if you produce apps which are sold or should be used for a longer time, then you should have a proper look at the library you pick. Here in the README in the app folder, I give you some suggestions and also give you some hints how to decide which library to pick. So first, of course, you have to check if the library is available for all the platforms you want to address. Then, of course, if you rely on this library heavily, it's important then that more than one developer is responsible for it, because whatever happens to this developer, or he or she might not be interested to update it in the future. And that's another question. How often is this library updated? As you have realized by now, Flutter is developing rapidly. So you have to be sure that all the libraries keep up with the current version. And how many other packages are dependent on the package you choose. Don't make your app too huge, too complicated. So where do you find all these hints to decide? Of course, you have here the platforms listed, and if you search, you can check here the platforms which are important for you. You can go to the repository. Here you will see how active the repository still is. And here you see how many people contribute to this repository. The versions you can look up in the repository or simply here already. So these were just some hints how to decide which library to use. The next thing I want to talk about is the folder structure. You should think up front which folder structure to follow. So you can go feature first, which is widely used and is getting more and more popular, or layer first or function first. Or you might also go for a mix of the different approaches. Discuss it in your team. This repository follows feature first. I can only say I decided for feature first because I think it's easier for you to get familiar with the application and its structure. Why do I think it's easier for you? Well, usually you start from the UI and want to understand the code. So if I go feature first, it's easier for you to start with the screen you see and dig into the code. There's only one thing where you could think of a layered approach if you start developing packages like a data layer, a data package, which is used in different applications. So whenever you have parts of the code which might be used in one application and in another application, think of packages. And also the data layer is a good example for a separate package because it might be tested more easily independent of all the Flutter stuff. The next thing I want to talk about is common widgets. In Flutter, the smallest UI part is a widget. And it's good practice to develop widgets such they may be reused in different pages. So these are called common widgets or shared widgets. So for example, in the application given, I have a async value widget. It's from Code with Andrea. I will provide a link. A message widget, a form field widget. If you collect data with different input fields, it's a form field, and I separated it in a separate widget. You might be tempted to encapsulate the code of a UI widget into a separate function to reuse it this way. A separate function has some disadvantages. For example, if it is stateless, it does not need to be rebuilt in many cases. So it will slow down your application if you call the function again and again and it needs to be rebuilt, or it will be rebuilt, although it's not necessary. That's why in Flutter you should always think of separate widgets. So we'll have a look at how it is structured. Usually you have some properties, and then you describe how it is built. The Wondrous app uses this approach heavily. So before you start developing something by yourself, have a look there. And as usual, before you copy-paste some code, think of a separate widget. The next thing, just before debugging, is logging. So if you want to know the order, or if a function is called, or needs some further information, and it might be too slow to debug everything properly, and you first want to have an idea, use logging. Logging is much better than just print or console or something like this. Logging is available in almost any platform. So whenever you program something in a platform, look for logging. This logger library is heavily used, and it's very simple and gives you a nice printout. I put this in the logger Dart file under utils, and here I define the pretty printer and make the logger available. So you just have to import this file, and you may use logger.d for debugging messages and so on. So skip all print commands and use logging. Accessibility is something very important which you should consider from the early start of your application. As in the web, it's only a small effort for yourself, but it's making the life much easier and improve the lives of many people. There are 3 things you should consider. It's color. Many people are colorblind. It's also contrast. There's everything about color and contrast. It's about sizes of the fonts of the widgets. For example, I increase the font size of my mobile to be able to read everything properly. And if the things are not readable because they don't fit on the screen, on the widget, I won't be able to use it properly. And the last thing is semantics or way of input. And there's also a great tool, the accessibility scanner for Android, to test your application automatically. And there are also some tests you can run on each screen to test your application automatically. So please read through this very properly. The next typical problem is internationalization or localization, so make your app available for different languages. Simply follow the instructions here. In the application we will find 2 ARP files. They are simple key-value pairs. Be careful not to put an extra comma here, as you might get used to it by implementing Flutter, where in every list you can add an extra comma without any problem. Here it makes a problem, and you have the translations in German here. First language is English, which is defined in. It's also possible to use placeholders and plurals. So far I did not need it, but have a look here at the documentation. So I used 2 extension methods from Code with Andrea. And if you don't know what an extension method is, well, it is what it says. It extends an existing class by additional methods. So instead of always writing app localization of this dot, you can easily write context.log and then the key as it is defined in your app file. To have these keys available, you first have to build the application. So in many cases, you get lazy and think, well, I use a hard-coded string here because I haven't defined the key so far. For example, I use hello here, then I get the information, use the const. So it's const text hello. And later on, I might forget that I put this hard-coded string into this text field. So it's difficult to find it later on. So it's good to just use hard-coded on the string itself. So instead of using just hello, you can use hello hard-coded. By this, you don't need const because it's not a constant, it's a function. You're applying extension method on the string itself. And you can easily find all those hard-coded strings in your project. So this extension method is for short writing, and this extension method is for those who become lazy and don't want to have this intermediate step, first building the application, then accessing the string you just put into the ARP file. Especially during development time, you might do this and change it more often. And before you push it to the server, you exchange all those hard-coded strings, and it's very easily done. The next big issue is design, or especially responsive design. Here you usually decide if you go tablet first or mobile first, or if your application should run on your smartwatch as well and on big screens. Especially if you address big screens and mobile, I suggest you go for tablet first. And it's always helpful to put your ideas on paper first. It might be very roughly sketched at the beginning, and then you iterate through it. And before you start coding, you should have a look at Figma, a great tool and heavily used in the design process. I will add some links for Figma too. And then you start programming. Usually, if you implement layout, you put everything in rows and columns. Use as less as possible and think which widget should fill available space. That's the expanded you wrap around this widget. In the last video, I added a link to the DevTools. There you can also play around with different properties of your layout to make it work. So I put it again in the description of this video as well. However, adaptive design is not about different screen sizes. It's also about different input methods like double click or tap or long press. So read through this properly and work through this code lab. And here you will find some helpful components and widgets that address and solve some typical problems already. If you want to improve your UI skills, I suggest you have a look at the Gallery app. Source code is available and you can browse through all the widgets they use and describe here. Animation is heavily used in mobile applications and it is getting more and more. Of course, you have all the Lottie files and animations available and you can integrate them easily into your application. Furthermore, you have a nice package which is called Animation and is well described in this video. For further requirements, well, it's a tutorial by itself to make good animations and decide which animation to use where, which is not the focus of this tutorial. And to finish this episode, I will have a look at the event loop. If you do event-oriented programming, as we do with Flutter, and usually we do with UI applications, you always have some sort of event loop running. And this event loop handles all the events. What is an event? It's like tapping a button. It's like scrolling through a page. It's like checking a checkbox and so on. Every user interaction typically results in an event. And these events need to be handled while your screen gets repainted and repainted 60 or 90 times per second. So if this handling of one event and the building, painting of your UI takes longer than the time you have if your screen refreshes 60 or 90 times per second, well, it might freeze, it might jank, it does not look proper. I also put a video for using the DevTools to analyze which screen is causing problems. To avoid these problems, Flutter and Dart makes heavily use of async and await and futures in general. So if you have something which takes longer to process, like you want to fetch an image from the internet, you start with the function and then you have a callback. So the function itself is processed fast, but it waits for the return of the call of the internet to fetch your image. And this callback might be processed in the next run of the event loop, so it will not block your UI. I hope you had a look at the material on Dart, on async programming, and if not, you're now motivated to do so. That was quite a bit. Use the comments to ask questions or send me an email to ask questions. I'm happy to give more explanations if needed. If not, I'm happy to. See you next time. Bye-bye.